The land was a study in browns and grays, a vast, unforgiving canvas stretched taut beneath a sky the color of a fresh bruise. Dust, fine as ground meal, rose in lazy plumes from the hooves of Elias Cain's horse, a raw-boned gelding that moved with the weary patience of a creature that had long given up hope of a soft bed or a full belly. The wind was a constant companion, a dry, hot breath that whispered of drought and decay. It carried the scent of sagebrush and something else, something metallic and old, like the lingering ghost of shed blood. Elias rode with his shoulders slumped, a posture that spoke not of weakness, but of a profound and settled exhaustion. He was a man running, but his enemy was not behind him. It was inside him, coiled in his gut and etched behind his eyes. Every mile he put between himself and the last place was just another mile traveled with the same ghosts. They were relentless, whispering in the moan of the wind, their faces appearing in the shifting shapes of the clouds overhead. He had been a hired gun, a man whose skill with a cult peacemaker had earned him a reputation that clung to him like the dust on his coat. It was a reputation bought with blood and paid for in sleepless nights. He was trying to outrun the man he had been, but the past had a long shadow, and it stretched for miles across the empty plains. For 3 days, the sky had been a merciless sheet of white-hot steel. Now, on the horizon, a darkness was gathering. Clouds, heavy and purple-bellied, began to pile upon one another, and the air grew thick with a tension that mirrored his own. A storm was coming. He could smell the ozone, a clean, sharp scent that promised a violence of its own. He urged his horse onward, not to escape the rain, but to find some meager shelter before it broke. He did not mind the water. He thought, grimly, that a man as stained as he was could stand in a downpour for a year and never come clean. The town appeared as if by magic, a miserable clutch of gray, weathered buildings squatting in a shallow basin. A faded sign, its letters peeling from the wood, declared it Dry Hollow. The name was a cruel joke, as the first fat, cold drops of rain began to fall. The dust that coated every surface turned instantly to a slick, greasy mud. The downpour came without warning, a sudden, furious deluge that hammered on the tin roofs and turned the single main street into a churning brown river. Elias dismounted in front of the livery stable, the leather of his saddle creaking in protest. He led his horse inside, the air thick with the familiar, comforting smells of hay, manure, and animal sweat. The stable hand, a boy no older than 16 with a shock of straw-colored hair, looked up at him, his eyes wide. The boy's gaze flickered from the deep-set weariness in Elias's eyes to the angry, puckered scar that cut a ragged path from his left temple down to his jaw, then to the worn, tied-down holster on his hip. He did not need to ask Elias's name. He had seen the posters, heard the stories whispered by travelers. "Just need a stall for the horse," Elias said, his voice a low rasp, unused for days. "And a dry corner for myself, if you've got one." "The barn's dry," the boy stammered, pointing with a pitchfork. "Horse is 2 bits. The corner is free." Elias nodded, dropping 2 coins into the boy's outstretched palm before unsaddling his horse. He worked with an economy of motion, his hands sure and practiced. He rubbed the gelding down with a rough burlap sack, his touch surprisingly gentle. The animal was the only living thing he allowed himself to care for. It asked for nothing but oats and water and did not judge him for the things he had done. Once the horse was settled, Elias stepped back out into the rain. Dry Hollow was a desolate place, made more so by the storm. Water streamed from the eaves of the general store. The blacksmith's forge was dark and silent, and the few windows that held a lamp's glow seemed small and vulnerable against the growing dark. The only place that showed any real sign of life was the saloon. The gilded cage. Laughter, coarse and loud, spilled out from behind its swinging doors, along with the tinny, cheerful sound of a poorly played piano. He knew what a place like this offered: cheap whiskey to dull the edges of memory, and the kind of company that asked no questions. He had no money for the first and no stomach for the second. Still, a man had to eat. He pushed through the doors, the sudden warmth and noise a physical blow. The air was thick with the smells of stale beer, unwashed bodies, and wet wool. A dozen men were scattered around the room, their faces illuminated by the smoky haze of the kerosene lamps. They fell silent as he entered, their eyes turning to him as one. The whispers started almost immediately, a low hiss that spread from table to table. He felt their stares like a physical weight, a familiar shroud of fear and morbid curiosity. He ignored them, making his way to the bar. It was then that he saw her. She was standing behind the long, scarred wooden bar, wiping a glass with a clean white cloth. Her movements were slow, deliberate, as if she were conserving every ounce of her strength. Her dress was a simple, faded calico, clean but mended in several places. Her hair, the color of dark honey, was pulled back in a severe bun, but a few stray wisps had escaped to curl around her temples, softened by the damp air. She was not beautiful in the way of the painted women who usually worked in such places. Her face was too thin, her eyes too large and shadowed with a sorrow so deep it seemed to have become a part of her. She was Clara Whitmore, and everyone in Dry Hollow knew her story. They knew she was a widow, that her husband, a decent, hard-working farmer named Thomas, had been killed 2 years prior during a raid on their small homestead. He had died trying to protect her, standing between her and a band of savage men. She had survived, but the light had gone out of her eyes, left with nothing. She had come to town and taken the only work she could find, serving drinks and cleaning up after the rough men who frequented the gilded cage. She endured their clumsy advances and the pitying glances of the town's more respectable women with a quiet, unyielding dignity that infuriated them both. Elias watched her as she worked, her expression carefully blank. She moved through the saloon like a ghost, refilling glasses, clearing away empty plates, never meeting anyone's eyes for more than a second. He saw the way the men looked at her, some with a crude, undisguised hunger, others with a pity that was just as insulting. He saw the effort it took for her to exist in this space, to breathe this foul air, to listen to their laughter and pretend it did not tear at the edges of her own grief. He ordered a bowl of stew and a piece of bread from the bartender, a portly man with a sweaty brow, and took it to a small, dark table in the corner. He ate slowly, his gaze never leaving her. He was a man who noticed things. He noticed the slight tremor in her hands when she poured a whiskey for a particularly loud ranch hand. He noticed the way her shoulders tensed when a man leaned in too close to whisper something in her ear. He saw a soul as haunted as his own, a different kind of survivor from a different kind of war. When he was finished, he paid the bartender and walked back out into the relentless rain. The storm had not lessened. If anything, it had grown in its fury. He headed for the livery, for the dry corner the boy had promised him. The alley that ran alongside the saloon was a narrow channel of mud and filth, littered with broken bottles and other refuse. As he passed the back entrance, he heard a sound that made him stop. A woman's voice, low and strained. "Please, just let me go." Then a man's voice, thick with drink. "Now, Clara, don't be like that. We're just being friendly. A pretty little widow like you must get awful lonely." A second man laughed, a wet, ugly sound. "Yeah, lonely. We can help with that." Elias stood motionless in the downpour, the rain plastering his hair to his scarred face. He did not want to get involved. He had promised himself he would not get involved in anything, ever again. Trouble was a magnet, and he was made of steel. He turned to walk away, to retreat to the quiet solitude of the barn. But then he heard her voice again, smaller this time, a fragile thread of sound nearly lost in the drumming of the rain. "No, please." Something inside him, a rusty, forgotten mechanism, ground into motion. He thought of the child's cry he had failed to answer, of the blood on his hands that no amount of rain could ever wash away. He could not save the dead. But the living, perhaps the living were a different matter. He turned and walked back, his boots making no sound in the deep mud. He rounded the corner of the building and saw them. 2 men, burly prospectors by the look of their clothes, had Clara pinned against the rough wooden wall of the saloon. One had her by the arms, his dirty fingers digging into her flesh. The other was standing in front of her, his hand reaching for the collar of her dress, a drunken leer on his face. Clara's eyes were squeezed shut, her face a pale mask of terror. She was not struggling. It was the stillness of a terrified animal that knows it is trapped, a surrender born of utter hopelessness. Elias did not say a word. He did not need to. He simply stepped out of the deeper shadows of the alley. His presence was enough. The man reaching for her dress froze, his hand hovering in midair. He turned, his eyes slowly focusing on the tall, rain-soaked figure standing before them. He saw the scar, the cold, dead calm in the stranger's eyes, and the gun that remained, for the moment, in its holster. Every man in the West knew that the most dangerous ones were those who did not need to make a threat. "The lady said no," Elias said, his voice quiet but carrying a weight that cut through the noise of the storm. The first man, the one holding her arms, let out a nervous laugh. "This ain't none of your concern, mister. We're just having a bit of fun." Elias took one slow step forward. The mud sucked at his boots. He did not look at the men. He looked only at Clara, at the raw terror in her eyes, which were now wide open and fixed on him. "I am making it my concern." There was a long moment of silence, broken only by the rain. The 2 prospectors looked at each other, a silent, drunken argument passing between them. They were big men, strong from their work, but they were not killers. They were looking at a killer. They could see it in the way he stood, in the absolute absence of fear or hesitation in his posture. He was a wolf, and they were just stray dogs who had cornered the wrong prey. The one holding Clara's arms released her abruptly, as if her skin had suddenly become red hot. He took a clumsy step back, holding his hands up in a gesture of surrender. "No trouble, mister. We were just leaving." His companion grunted his agreement, and the 2 of them stumbled away, disappearing into the dark, wet street. Elias did not watch them go. He remained where he was, his gaze still on Clara. She stood pressed against the wall, her arms wrapped around herself as if to hold her own fractured pieces together. She was trembling, not from the cold, but from the violent aftermath of fear. Rain dripped from her hair and ran down her pale cheeks like tears. For a long moment, she just stared at him, her chest rising and fall in shallow, ragged breaths. He saw fear in her eyes. Yes, but it was a new fear, one that had simply replaced the old. She had been saved from jackals by a wolf, and she did not know which was worse. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Elias gave a curt, almost imperceptible nod. He did not know what to say. Words of comfort were foreign to him. They felt like lies in his mouth. He was not a good man. He was a violent man who had, for one brief moment, pointed his violence in a useful direction. It changed nothing. She took a small, hesitant step away from the wall, her gaze darting from his face to his hands, then back to his eyes. She saw the hardness there, the look of a man who had seen too much of the world's ugliness. His silence was unnerving, a heavy blanket that seemed to smother the air around them. His scars were a map of a life she could not begin to imagine, and his eyes looked at her for too long, with an intensity that felt like a physical touch, as if he could see the cracks in her soul. I should go inside," she said, her voice trembling. She turned and practically fled, pushing through the back door of the saloon without a backward glance, leaving him alone in the alley. Elias stood in the rain for a long time after she was gone, the water washing over him, cold and impartial. He had done a good thing, perhaps the first good thing he had done in years, and all it brought him was the familiar, bitter taste of ash in his mouth. He had seen the terror in her eyes, and he knew that a good portion of it had been for him. He was a monster who had chased away other monsters, and that was all. He turned and walked to the livery stable, the mud clinging to his boots like the past he could not shake. That night, the storm broke its chains and raged across the plains. Lightning tore jagged wounds in the black sky, followed by peals of thunder that shook the very foundations of the town. Elias lay in a pile of clean straw in the livery barn, but he did not sleep. He closed his eyes and saw blood. So much blood, soaking into the dry, thirsty earth of a place he could not forget. He heard a child's cry, a thin, high-pitched wail of terror and pain that he had been too late to stop. It was a sound that had become the soundtrack to his nightmares. He saw a man's face, a good man, a father, whose life had ended at Elias's own hand. He had been paid to do a job, and he had done it. That was the simple, damning truth of it. He had killed for money, and in doing so, had destroyed a family, becoming the very kind of man who had destroyed Clara's life. He rolled onto his side, his jaw clenched, the scar on his face a tight, pulling reminder of his sins. A few hundred feet away, in a small, sparse room on the second floor of the boarding house, Clara Whitmore stood by her window. She could not sleep. The encounter behind the saloon had stripped away the numb shell she usually wore, leaving her nerves raw and exposed. She looked out at the storm, at the sheets of rain sweeping through the muddy street. Her gaze was fixed on the livery barn. A single lantern cast a weak, flickering light from within, and through the gaps in the boards, she could just make out a dark shape. Him, the stranger. She hugged her arms to her chest, a shiver running through her that had nothing to do with the cold. She should have been terrified of him. Everything about him screamed danger. From his silent intensity to the weapon that rode so naturally on his hip, he was the embodiment of the violence that had shattered her world and taken her Thomas from her. And yet, he had helped her. He had not touched her, had not even raised his voice. He had simply stood there, a bulwark of quiet menace, and the other men had scattered like rats. She saw both danger and protection in that dark, silent shape in the barn. He was a storm, just like the one that raged outside, capable of immense destruction. But a storm could also be a cleansing, a washing away of the dust and the heat. She felt a strange, frightening pull toward him, a flicker of curiosity about the man behind the scars and the silence. It was a feeling she had not had in 2 years, and its presence filled her with a profound sense of guilt and confusion. The storm raged on, a wild and elemental fury. The wind howled like a grieving animal, and the rain fell as if the sky itself were weeping. In the flashes of lightning, the little town of Dry Hollow looked fragile, temporary, as if the whole collection of wooden buildings could be swept away at any moment, returned to the mud from which it had been built. Everything felt like it could collapse: the sky, the town, the carefully constructed walls around 2 broken hearts, and in the darkness, 2 lonely souls listened to the rain, each trapped in a prison of their own making, unaware that the other was doing the very same thing. The storm passed as violently as it had arrived, leaving behind a world washed clean and smelling of wet earth and pine. The sun that rose the next morning was a pale, watery thing, but it was enough to stir Elias from the barn. He had no intention of staying in Dry Hollow. A town with watching eyes was no place for a man trying to become a ghost. But his horse needed a proper shoeing, and his own supplies were low. Work was a necessity, a means to an end. The end was always the same: the horizon. He found it at the Abernathy Ranch, a sprawling property 5 miles out of town, its fences flattened in a dozen places by the storm's fury. John Abernathy was a hard, sun-cured man with eyes that missed nothing. He looked Elias over, taking in the scar and the gun, and his expression was one of wary pragmatism. "I need a man who knows how to work, not one who knows how to cause trouble," Abernathy said, his voice flat. "I'm just looking for a week's wage," Elias replied, his tone equally devoid of emotion. "I can mend a fence." Abernathy considered him for a long moment, then nodded toward a wagon loaded with fresh posts and spools of wire. "Pay is $1 a day, plus meals. You can sleep in the barn. You start now." Elias accepted without another word. The work was hard. Solitary labor under a vast, empty sky. He dug post holes in the damp, rocky soil until his back ached and his hands were raw. He stretched the sharp wire until his muscles burned with the strain. He welcomed the pain. It was a clean, honest hurt that crowded out the other, more complicated kind. Out here, with only the wind and the distant lowing of cattle for company, he could almost believe he was just another man, a drifter earning his keep. He could almost forget the weight of the gun on his hip and the faces of the dead that visited him in his sleep. He worked from sunup to sundown, keeping to himself, hoping to remain unseen, a shadow on the edge of the world. But the world had a way of finding him. 3 days into his work, a buckboard wagon rattled up the long, rutted road to the ranch house. Elias was sinking a post near the main gate, and he stopped, leaning on his shovel. As he watched it approach, he recognized the driver at once. It was Clara. She was bringing the midday meal for the ranch hands, a service she provided for a few coins to supplement her meager earnings from the saloon. She pulled the horse to a halt and set the brake, her movements graceful and efficient. She did not seem to see him at first. Her face was set in the same expression of weary resignation he had seen in the saloon. She climbed down and went to the back of the wagon, beginning to unload a large pot of stew and a basket of fresh bread. One of the ranch hands, a young man named Billy, called out to her, "Smells good, Mrs. Whitmore." She offered him a small, fleeting smile that did not reach her eyes. "I hope you boys are hungry." As she turned back to the wagon, her gaze fell upon Elias. For a fraction of a second, her composure faltered, her eyes widened, and a faint flush rose on her cheeks. She looked away quickly, her hands fumbling with the lid of the stew pot. Elias felt a strange, unwelcome tightening in his chest. He had been a fool to think he could remain invisible. He did not join the other hands as they gathered around the wagon, filling their plates with a cheerful clatter of tinware. He remained by his section of the fence, a silent, solitary figure. After a few moments, Clara ladled a portion of stew into a bowl, took a piece of bread, and walked toward him. She moved with a clear reluctance, as if crossing a dangerous, invisible line. She held the bowl out to him. "You should eat." Her voice was soft, little more than a whisper. He looked at her hand, at the fine, delicate bones of her wrist. He could see the faint blue veins beneath her pale skin. He took the bowl from her, their fingers brushing for the briefest of moments. The contact was like a spark of static electricity, a tiny, shocking jolt that seemed to pass between them. She pulled her hand back as if burned. "Thank you," he said, his voice a low rumble. She gave a small, nervous nod, her eyes fixed on a point somewhere over his shoulder. "You are welcome." She turned and walked back to the wagon without another word. The silence that fell between them was heavier, more charged than any conversation. It was filled with the unspoken memory of the alley, of her fear and his intervention. It was filled with 100 questions neither of them dared to ask. This became their routine. Every day, she would arrive with the midday meal. Every day, she would bring him his portion, her eyes averted, her face a carefully composed mask. They exchanged only the barest of civilities, a quiet "thank you," a whispered "you are welcome." But with each passing day, the silence between them grew deeper, richer, freighted with a tension that was almost unbearable. He found himself watching for the distant cloud of dust that signaled the approach of her wagon. He found himself noticing new things about her, the way a stray strand of hair caught the sunlight and gleamed like gold, the determined set of her jaw, the profound sadness that never quite left her eyes, even when she smiled at the other men. Clara, for her part, found herself caught in a disorienting spiral of emotions. Each trip to the Abernathy Ranch was an ordeal. She was acutely aware of Elias's presence, felt his gaze on her even when her back was turned. He was nothing like her Thomas. Thomas had been a man of sunshine and easy laughter, his hands gentle from tilling the earth. Elias was a man of shadows and silence, his hands calloused and scarred from work she could only guess at. He was dangerous, and everything in her, every instinct of self-preservation, screamed at her to stay away. And yet, she could not. Loneliness was a hollow ache in her chest, a constant companion that had been with her for 2 long years. She knew what it did to a person, how it could wear you down until you were willing to grasp at any hint of connection, no matter how perilous. Elias did not offer her pity, like the other townsfolk. He did not look at her with the crude hunger of the men in the saloon. He looked at her with a quiet, unnerving understanding, as if he could see the matching emptiness inside her. And that, more than anything, both terrified and drew her in. The town, of course, began to notice. Dry Hollow was a small place, and gossip was its primary currency. It started with raised eyebrows and meaningful glances when Clara bought supplies at the general store. Then came the whispers, quiet at first, like the rustling of dry leaves. Mrs. Gable, the wife of the town's preacher and the self-appointed guardian of its morality, was the first to give the whispers a voice. "It is a shame," she said to a rapt audience of 2 other women over a display of calico fabric. "What becomes of a woman without a man to guide her? Poor Clara. First she lowers herself to working in that dreadful saloon, and now she is taking up with that drifter out at the Abernathy place. A killer, they say." The words, sharp and venomous, spread through the town like a fever. They followed Clara down the street, clung to her in the church pews on Sunday, and poisoned the air around her. She felt their judgment like a physical weight, a brand of shame pressed upon her skin. She was a widow. Her grief was supposed to be her shield, her virtue her only possession. To be linked with any man was a betrayal of her husband's memory. To be linked with a man like Elias Kane was an unforgivable sin. She began to dread her trips to the ranch, but the thought of not going, of not seeing him, left a void that was even more frightening. She was trapped between her shame and her longing, between the ghost of the man she had loved and the living presence of the man she feared she was coming to need. One hot, dry afternoon, the simmering tension at the ranch boiled over. The young hand, Billy, was trying to break a fiery chestnut stallion, a beautiful but unpredictable animal. The horse, sensing the boy's fear, suddenly reared, its front hooves lashing the air. Billy, caught off guard, was thrown from the saddle, his foot snagged in the stirrup. The stallion bolted. Panic erupted. The other hands shouted, running for cover as the maddened horse galloped blindly across the corral, dragging the helpless boy behind it. Billy's head bounced sickeningly against the hard-packed earth. Elias had been tightening a wire fence 50 yards away. He did not shout. He did not hesitate. He dropped his tools and moved with a speed and grace that was terrifying to behold. He did not run at the horse, which would have spooked it further. Instead, he ran in a calm, deliberate arc, anticipating its path. As the stallion thundered past, Elias launched himself forward, grabbing for the trailing reins. His grip was like iron. The force of the horse nearly pulled his arms from their sockets, but he held on, his boots digging furrows in the dirt. He did not fight the animal's strength with his own. Instead, he used its momentum, turning with it, speaking in a low, steady voice that was somehow audible above the chaos. "Easy now. Easy, boy. Whoa now. Settle." His voice was calm, gentle, a strange counterpoint to the raw, physical power he was exerting. Slowly, miraculously, the horse began to respond. Its panicked flight slowed to a canter, then a trot, then a trembling, snorting halt. Elias never stopped talking to it, his hand moving from the reins to the horse's sweaty neck, stroking it with a firm, soothing touch. The stallion's sides were heaving, its eyes rolling, but the terror was leaving it, replaced by the calming influence of this quiet, steady man. Only when the horse was still did Elias turn his attention to the boy. He knelt and worked the twisted stirrup, freeing Billy's foot. The boy was dazed and bleeding from a cut on his scalp, but he was alive. John Abernathy and the other hands rushed over. As Abernathy helped the boy to his feet, the ranch foreman, a burly man named Jed, turned on the horse, his face purple with rage. He raised a thick leather whip. "I will teach this devil to—" He never finished the sentence. Elias was on his feet in an instant, his body positioned between the foreman and the horse. He did not touch Jed, but he did not have to. His eyes, which had been so calm and gentle moments before, were now chips of blue ice. A cold, dangerous fury radiated from him, a palpable force that made the big foreman take an involuntary step back. "The horse was scared," Elias said, his voice dangerously quiet. "The boy made a mistake. You will not touch the animal." Jed sputtered, his hand tightening on the whip. "That is Mr. Abernathy's call, not yours." "No," Abernathy said, stepping forward. His eyes were on Elias, and his expression was one of newfound respect. "The man is right. The horse is just an animal. Take the boy to the house and see to his head. Jed!" The foreman, chastened, lowered the whip and stalked away. Elias gave the horse one last pat on the neck before turning and walking back to his fence line, as if nothing had happened. But everyone had seen it. They had seen his capability, his gentleness in the face of panic, and the cold, swift temper that flared at the sight of senseless violence. Clara arrived with the wagon less than an hour later. The story of what Elias had done had already spread among the men, and they spoke of him now with a mixture of awe and fear. As she served the food, she could feel the change in the atmosphere. She watched Elias from afar. He was working again, his movements steady and rhythmic, but she could see a tightness in his shoulders, a rigid control that had not been there before. Later that afternoon, as she was preparing to leave, she went to the stable to get a fresh bucket of water for her horse. As she rounded the corner of the building, she heard quiet, sharp voices. It was Mrs. Gable, who had come to the ranch to deliver a quilt to Mrs. Abernathy. She was speaking to her hostess, but her voice carried, "I simply cannot imagine what John is thinking, keeping a man like that on, a murderer, and poor Clara, throwing herself at him. It is a disgrace to her husband's memory. She has no shame at all." The word struck Clara like a physical blow. Every fear, every insecurity, every ounce of shame she had been fighting coalesced into a single, unbearable point of pain. She froze, her hand on the stable door, unable to breathe. She heard Mrs. Abernathy murmur something in reply, a weak defense, but Clara did not stay to hear it. She turned and fled, stumbling blindly behind the stable, her vision blurred by hot, sudden tears. She sank to the ground, her back against the rough wood, and choked back a sob. She did not make a sound, but her whole body shook with the force of her grief and humiliation. It was all true. She was a disgrace. What would Thomas think of her, feeling these things for a man who lived by the gun, the very instrument of his own death? The shame was a bitter poison in her throat. She did not know how long she sat there before a shadow fell over her. She looked up, her eyes blurred and swollen, to see Elias standing there. He must have seen the whole exchange. His face was unreadable, carved from stone, but his eyes held an expression of such profound, quiet empathy that it shattered what was left of her control. It was not pity. It was understanding. It was the look of a man who knew shame intimately, who lived with it every day. He said nothing. He simply shrugged off his dusty, worn coat and knelt in front of her. He draped it carefully over her shoulders. The fabric was coarse and smelt of dust, sweat, and the clean scent of the wind. but it was warm from his body, and it felt like a shield, a protective weight against the cold cruelty of the world. She stared up at him, at the scar on his face, at the sorrow in his eyes that mirrored her own. A single tear escaped and traced a path through the dust on her cheek. "You will break me," she whispered, her voice raw and broken. "You will break me if you look at me like that." It was not an accusation. It was a plea, a confession. He was looking at her, really looking, and seeing all the broken pieces she tried so desperately to hide, and in his gaze, she felt them begin to crack even further. A flicker of something, pain, regret, a deep and terrible sorrow, passed across his face. He held her gaze for one long, agonizing moment. Then, he broke it. He rose to his feet and turned away from her, presenting her with his back, as if he could not bear the truth of her words, or the effect he was having on her. As if on cue, the sky, which had been clear all day, began to change. The wind picked up, and the clouds began to gather once more. The first drops of a cold, steady rain began to fall, spattering in the dust around them. He did not turn back. He simply walked away, his shoulders set in a hard, straight line, and headed toward the distant barn he called home. He walked back into his isolation, alone. Clara sat there, huddled in his coat, the rain beginning to soak her hair and dress. The warmth of the coat was a stark contrast to the cold emptiness that surrounded her. She watched him go, and she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that something dangerous and irreversible had awakened between them. It was a fragile, terrifying thing, a feeling born of shared wounds and silent understanding. It was a desire tangled so completely with guilt that she could not tell one from the other, and she knew, as the cold rain fell harder, that it had the power to either save her or destroy her completely. The uneasy peace that had settled over Dry Hollow was shattered by a rider who came at a full gallop, his horse lathered in sweat and foam, its eyes wide with terror. He was a boy from the Miller homestead, 10 miles to the south, and he brought with him a story of fire, smoke, and violence, a band of raiders. He stammered to the crowd that gathered around him in the muddy street, had swept down from the hills at dawn. They were not soldiers or warriors. They were vultures, men who preyed on the isolated and the weak. They had taken what they wanted and burned the rest. Fear, cold and sharp, spread through the town like a contagion. Dry Hollow was just as isolated, just as vulnerable. The men gathered in the gilded cage, the whiskey doing little to steady their nerves. Their talk was loud and full of bluster, but their eyes betrayed their anxiety. They were farmers and merchants, not fighters. They owned hunting rifles and shotguns, but few had ever aimed a weapon at another human being. Elias was at the Abernathy ranch when the news arrived. He listened to the frantic talk, his expression unchanging, but a familiar coldness settled in his gut. He knew this kind of violence. He knew the men who perpetrated it. They were men without honor, driven by a greed so corrosive it ate away their souls. They were men like the ones he used to ride with. He finished his day's work, collected his pay from a worried John Abernathy, and rode not towards the horizon, but back towards the troubled town. He found the men of Dry Hollow in the midst of a disorganized panic. The blacksmith, a burly man named Peterson, was arguing with a general store owner about who should stand watch where. Others were talking of hiding their families in the old storm cellar beneath the church. There was no plan, only a rising tide of fear. Elias stepped into the saloon, and the room fell silent. All eyes turned to him. In that moment, they did not see a drifter or a pariah. They saw a man whose reputation, once a source of their fear, was now their only source of hope. "They will come for the weakest points first," Elias said, his voice cutting through the tense silence. "The edges of town, the outlying homes, they will look for easy targets." Peterson, taking charge, turned to him fully. "You have seen this kind of thing before. Cain." It was a statement, not a question. Elias gave a curt nod. "Then you can help us. Tell us what to do." A strange, Bitter irony washed over Elias. These men, who had whispered about him and feared him, were now asking him to become the very thing he was trying to escape. For a long moment, he was tempted to refuse, to mount his horse and ride away, leaving them to their fate. It was not his fight. But then he saw an image of Clara, her face pale and frightened in the alley, and the memory of the child's cry echoed in his mind. He could not run, not this time. "Barricade the north end of the street," he said, his voice hard and sure. "Use wagon. It will not stop them, but it will slow them down. Give you a better field of fire." He began to speak with a cold, practical authority, outlining a simple but effective defense. He pointed out the best vantage points for riflemen, the roof of the general store, the church steeple. He instructed them to place buckets of water near every building to fight fires. He was not a leader, but he understood the grim geometry of a fight. He knew how to think like a predator. The men listened, their fear slowly giving way to a grim sense of purpose. They moved to follow his instructions, their movements now organized and efficient. The preacher, Reverend Miller, approached Elias, holding out a heavy Winchester rifle. "You will want this," the preacher said, his voice firm. "Your experience will be invaluable on the line." Elias looked at the rifle. He saw the polished wood of the stock, the cold, dark gleam of the barrel. He saw an instrument of death, an extension of the man he no longer wanted to be. His hands, resting at his sides, clenched into fists. He thought of the blood, of the faces of the men he had killed, of the weight of their lives on his soul. "No," he said, his voice a low rasp. Reverend Miller frowned. "Son, this is no time for whatever this is. The town needs every man who can shoot." "I will help," Elias said, his gaze as hard as granite. "I will tell you where to stand and when to fire, but I will not hold a gun." A murmur of disbelief and anger went through the small group of men standing nearby. Peterson, the blacksmith, stepped forward, his face red with frustration. "What kind of man are you? We are asking you to protect us, and you refuse to even pick up a weapon?" Elias turned his deadened eyes on the blacksmith. "You do not want me to be the man I am when I am holding a gun," he said, and the coldness in his voice was so absolute, so final, that it silenced all further argument. He turned and walked away, leaving them to stare after him. Their hope now mingled with a profound and unsettling confusion. The attack came just after dusk. It was not a coordinated assault, but a chaotic, terrifying raid. The raiders swept in from the south, whooping and firing their pistols into the air, their primary goal to create panic. A torch was thrown onto the roof of the livery stable, and the dry hay inside went up with a roar. Flames lit the rainy night sky, casting dancing, demonic shadows across the main street. Clara was in her home, a small, two-room rented house at the very edge of town. It was the house she and Thomas had dreamed of leaving, the temporary shelter that had become her permanent prison. It held the last few remnants of her former life. A rocking chair Thomas had built, a small collection of books, her wedding quilt folded carefully at the foot of her bed. When the first shots echoed through the town, she blew out her lamp and crouched by the window, her heart hammering against her ribs. She could hear the shouts of the town's defenders, the sharp crack of rifles, and the terrifying, inhuman yells of the attackers. The orange glow from the burning livery stable painted her small room in a frightening light. She watched as two of the raiders, their faces illuminated by the fire, galloped past her house. One of them carried a flaming torch. With a wild laugh, he hurled it through her front window. It landed on the worn rag rug in the center of the room. For a moment, it just lay there, sputtering. Then a small lick of flame curled up, tasted the dry fabric, and blossomed. Clara cried out, scrambling for the water bucket she kept by the hearth. But it was too late. The flames leaped from the rug to the curtains, from the curtains to the dry wooden walls. The smoke was thick and acrid, choking her, blinding her. She stumbled back, coughing, her eyes streaming. The fire was devouring everything, consuming her past, her memories. She could see the rocking chair, Thomas's chair, silhouetted against the growing inferno before it too was swallowed by the flames. A wave of heat and smoke drove her back. She lurched for the back door, threw it open, and fell out into the muddy yard. Gasping for air, she turned and watched, helpless, as the roof of her small home sagged, groaned, and collapsed inward with a shower of sparks and embers. Everything. She had lost everything. Again. The raid was short and brutal. The raiders had not expected an organized defense. After taking some casualties and realizing the town would not be an easy prize, they retreated back into the darkness, their whoops and hollers fading into the night. The rain, which had held off during the attack, began to fall again. A cold, miserable drizzle that hissed on the hot embers of the burning buildings. The townsfolk emerged from their shelters, their faces pale and smudged with soot. They had held the town, but the cost was high. The livery was a smoking skeleton, and 2 other small homes, including Clara's, were gone. Elias moved through the aftermath, his face a grim mask. He had done what he promised, directing the defense from the shadows, his voice a calm, steady presence in the chaos. But he felt no victory, only the familiar, sickening feeling of being adjacent to violence. He was searching, his eyes scanning the crowds, looking for one face. He found her standing where her home used to be. The rain had plastered her thin dress to her body and her dark honey hair to her scalp. She was barefoot, having fled without her shoes, her feet sinking into the cold, wet mud. She was not crying. She was just staring at the smoldering pile of timber and ash that had, an hour ago, been her life. Her body was trembling from head to foot, a continuous, violent shiver that was born of shock and cold, and a grief so profound it had no outlet. He walked up to her, his own boots squelching in the mud. He said nothing, simply stood beside her. He took off his coat, the same one he had given her before, and wrapped it around her shaking shoulders. She did not seem to notice. Her eyes remained fixed on the ruins. "It is all gone," she whispered, her voice a hollow, broken thing. "Everything." He knew that words were useless. There was no comfort for this kind of loss. He gently took her by the arm. Her skin was ice cold. "Come with me." She did not resist. She allowed him to lead her away from the ruin of her life, away from the watching, pitying eyes of the townspeople. She walked beside him like a ghost, her bare feet leaving small, tragic prints in the mud. He led her to his horse, lifted her onto the saddle as if she weighed nothing, and mounted behind her, pulling the edges of his coat more tightly around her. He urged the horse not towards the center of town, but away from it, up into the dark, rain-swept hills that overlooked Dry Hollow. He had found the place weeks ago, a small, abandoned line cabin tucked away in a grove of pines. It was little more than a single room with a stone fireplace and a leaky roof, but it was shelter, and it was isolated. He had been staying there instead of the ranch barn, treasuring its solitude. Now, it would be a refuge. He got her inside, out of the relentless rain, and immediately set to building a fire. His movements were swift and sure. Soon, a small blaze was crackling in the hearth, pushing back the damp and the cold. The flickering light cast long shadows on the rough stone walls. He found a clean, dry blanket and wrapped it around her, then removed his wet coat. She was still trembling, her teeth chattering. He sat on the hearth across from her, watching her, waiting. For a long time, the only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the steady drumming of the rain on the roof. Finally, she spoke, her voice still a raw whisper. She did not look at him, but at the flames, as if the story were written there. "My husband, Thomas," she began. "He was a good man, a gentle man. He would not have known how to even hold a gun properly." She paused, taking a ragged breath. The men who came to our farm, they were not like the ones tonight. They were cruel for the sport of it. They wanted to hurt us." She hugged the blanket tighter around herself. Thomas stood in front of me. He had nothing but a pitchfork. He told them they would have to go through him. And they did. They laughed while they did it. Her gaze finally lifted from the fire and met his. Her eyes were not filled with tears, but with a terrible, hollow clarity. He died trying to protect me from men with guns. Men who lived by violence. Men like you, she said. Then she added, her voice breaking. The kind of man you used to be. It was the truth, laid bare between them in the flickering firelight. It was not an accusation, but a simple, devastating statement of fact. He was the specter that had haunted her for 2 years, the archetype of the man who had destroyed her life. And now he was her savior. The irony was a knife twisting in both their hearts. Elias looked down at his own hands, at the calluses and scars. They were the hands of a killer. He could not deny it. Her words had unlocked the door to the darkest room in his soul, and now he had to let her see inside. "I used to ride with a man named Jedediah Stone," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "We were not just raiders. We were worse. We hired out our guns to the highest bidder. We enforced claims, scared off squatters, collected debts. It was all just a clean way of saying we hurt people for money." He stared into the fire, but he was seeing something else entirely. I was good at it. I told myself it was just a job, that the people we went up against were no better than we were. It was an easy lie to believe, until one day. He stopped, his jaw working. "We were sent to clear a family off a piece of land a cattle baron wanted. The man, the father, he was like your Thomas. He just wanted to protect his family. He came out with a shotgun. I was faster." The cabin was silent save for the fire. Elias did not need to say what happened next. His boy saw it. He could not have been more than 7. He just stood on the porch and cried. Not loud, just a quiet, broken sound. And I saw what I was. Not a hired gun. Not a tough man making a living. I was a monster that made children cry over the bodies of their fathers. I rode out that day and I never went back. I have been running from that boy's face ever since. He fell silent. He had never told anyone. The confession lay in the air between them, heavy and raw. They were 2 sides of the same brutal coin. She, the victim of meaningless violence. He, the perpetrator of it. That night, they did not speak again. He gave her the single cot, taking a spot on the floor by the fire for himself. In the deep, dark hours of the night, with the rain still whispering against the roof, they cried, separately, silently, so the other would not hear. She cried for the good man she had lost and the life that had been stolen from her. He cried for the man he had killed and the soul he had forfeited. They both cried for the crushing, unbearable conviction that they were broken beyond repair, that neither of them could ever deserve forgiveness. Dawn came, but it brought no light, only a continuation of the gray, weeping sky. The rain still fell, a soft, persistent murmur. Elias rose from the hard floor, his body stiff and his spirit weary. He looked over at Clara. She was awake. She was standing by the cabin's door, which hung crookedly on one hinge, a testament to the cabin's long neglect. Her back was to him. She was trying to fix it. She had found a loose piece of wood and was trying to wedge it into the broken frame with her bare hands. Her fingers were white with the effort, her shoulders trembling. It was a futile, impossible task, but she persisted. A desperate, silent refusal to accept that some things were simply too broken to mend. He watched her for a long moment. This woman who had lost everything twice over, still trying to build a defense against the storm with nothing but her own 2 hands. And in that small, hopeless gesture, he saw a flicker of something he thought had been extinguished in himself long ago. The stubborn, heartbreaking will to simply endure. He took the splintered piece of wood from her numb fingers. His touch was brief, but it sent a warmth through her that had nothing to do with the fire. He did not speak. He simply took the door off its one remaining hinge, laid it flat on the floor of the cabin, and began to work. Using his knife and a few salvaged nails he found in a corner, he repaired the frame with a focused, quiet competence. He moved as if mending things were the most natural act in the world. When he was done, he hung the door again. It swung smoothly, closing with a soft, solid thud that shut out the gray, weeping morning. That sound, more than any words, was a promise. It was the sound of shelter. In the days that followed, a fragile, unspoken truce settled between them. The raw confessions of that first night were never mentioned again, but they lingered in the small space. A shared foundation of brokenness upon which they began to build something new. A quiet routine took shape, dictated by the simple, pressing needs of survival. Each morning, Elias would take his rifle and disappear into the misty hills, returning hours later with a rabbit or a brace of quail. Clara, who had learned to stretch a single potato into a meal for 3, would take his offering and transform it into a savory stew that filled the small cabin with the scent of hearth and home. He chopped firewood, the steady, rhythmic thud of his axe a constant, reassuring heartbeat in the stillness of the forest. She would gather the split logs, her arms full of the sharp, clean scent of pine. Sometimes, as he passed her the wood to feed the fire, their hands would brush. The contact was electric, a jolt of awareness that would cause them both to pull back, a flush rising on her cheeks, a muscle tightening in his jaw. They learned the geography of each other's silence. They could sit for an hour on opposite sides of the hearth, he cleaning his rifle, she mending a tear in his shirt with threads she had painstakingly unraveled from her own ruined dress. And the quiet was not empty. It was a space filled with a deep and intricate understanding, a language of shared glances and gentle movements. He learned the nuances of her expressions, the slight downward turn of her mouth that meant she was thinking of her husband, the way her eyes would soften when she looked into the fire. She learned to read the tension in his shoulders, to know when the ghosts of his past were riding him particularly hard. Their closeness deepened in these small, stolen moments. It was in the way he began to leave a small bundle of wildflowers on the table for her to find in the mornings. It was in the way she started saving him the best portion of the meal, setting it aside to stay warm if he was late returning. It was a delicate, dangerous dance of 2 people who had forgotten the steps to tenderness, each terrified of making a misstep. The tension in the cabin was a constant presence, a feeling both exquisitely tender and deeply forbidden. One evening, as he was unbuttoning his shirt to wash at the basin, she saw him wince as the fabric pulled against his shoulder. "You are hurt," she said, her voice soft. It was not a question. He glanced down, shrugging it off. "It is nothing. A scratch from the raid." But she could see it was more than a scratch. A piece of shrapnel or a splinter had left a deep, angry-looking gash that was beginning to fester. "Sit," she commanded, her tone leaving no room for argument. She tore a clean strip from the hem of her old petticoat and soaked it in hot water from the kettle. He sat on the edge of the cot, his back to her, his shoulders broad and rigid. She knelt behind him and gently began to clean the wound. The skin around it was hot to the touch, as her fingers, surprisingly deft and gentle, probed the edge of the cut to clean out the debris. His entire body went taut. He flinched, a sharp, violent jerk, as if she had touched him with a hot poker. "Did I hurt you?" she asked, her hands pulling back instantly. "No," he gritted out, his voice strained. He was not looking at her, but at the wall, his eyes focused on a memory she could not see. She understood then. It was not the pain of the present that made him flinch. It was the pain of the past. The wound on his shoulder was a gateway to other wounds, deeper and more grievous. She saw the ragged, silvery lines of old scars crisscrossing his back, a silent testament to a life of violence. Her heart ached for him, for the battles he had fought both inside and out. She did not ask. She did not press him for the story behind the scars, or the memory that had just passed behind his eyes. She knew what it was to carry a past that could rise up and ambush you without warning. Respecting his silence was the greatest kindness she could offer. Her touch, when it returned to his skin, was even gentler than before. She cleaned the wound with a quiet efficiency, then bound it with the clean cloth. Throughout it all, he remained perfectly still, a statue of rigid control, and she pretended not to feel the fine tremors that ran through his muscles beneath her hands. When she was finished, she tied off the bandage. "There," she whispered. He let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for a long time. He turned his head slightly, his scarred cheek toward her. "Thank you, Clara," he said, his voice rough with an emotion she could not name. It was the first time he had used her name. It sounded strange and beautiful and dangerous in the quiet cabin. But their isolated world could not remain untouched forever. They needed supplies: flour, salt, coffee. After a week in the hills, Clara knew she had to go back to town. She dreaded it, but it was a necessity. She braided her hair, smoothed down the wrinkles in her one remaining dress, and walked the long miles back to Dry Hollow, her heart a cold, heavy stone in her chest. The town felt different, or perhaps she was the one who had changed. The whispers were no longer whispers. They were a low, hostile hum that followed her everywhere. As she entered the general store, conversations stopped. The women who had once offered her their thin, pitying smiles now looked at her with open condemnation. Mrs. Gable, standing by the counter, turned her back on Clara completely, a gesture of social banishment so absolute it was like a slap in the face. Clara kept her head high, her face a mask of determined composure. She made her purchases, her hands trembling slightly as she counted out the coins. She felt their eyes on her back as she left, 100 invisible needles pricking her skin. They saw her not as a widow who had been saved from a fire, but as a fallen woman, living in sin with a killer in the hills. She was halfway back to the cabin, her basket heavy on her arm, when she heard the sound of a horse behind her. She turned to see Reverend Miller riding toward her. His face, usually so placid, was set in grim, determined lines. He dismounted, his expression a mixture of stern duty and genuine concern. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, his voice somber. "Clara, I had hoped the rumors were not true." Clara clutched her basket tighter. "Reverend, I have come as a friend and as your pastor," he said, stepping closer. "The things people are saying, it is a terrible stain upon your character and upon the memory of your good husband." Guilt, sharp and familiar, twisted in her gut. "I have done nothing to be ashamed of." The words felt like a lie, even to her. "You are a widow, living alone and unprotected in the hills with a man of violent reputation," he pressed, his voice rising with conviction. "You must see how it looks. You must understand the damage you are doing to your soul. The town will not accept this. A widow's virtue is all she has. Child, it is a precious gift. Do not cast it away for this." He gestured vaguely toward the hills, as if Elias were some kind of creature lurking in the woods. "Come back to town. The church will find a place for you. We will help you, but you must repent. You must leave that man and return to a righteous path." Clara stared at him, her heart a battleground. Every word he spoke echoed the teachings of her entire life. He was right, by the world's standards, by the town's standards, by the standards she herself had once held. She was wrong. She was risking her reputation, her place in the community, her very soul. The guilt was a suffocating wave, threatening to pull her under. But then she thought of the cabin. She thought of the quiet companionship, the shared glances, the respectful silence as she tended his wound. She thought of the wildflowers on the table and the steady, reassuring sound of his axe. It was not sin she had found in the hills. It was a fragile, tender peace she had not known she was still capable of feeling. For the first time in her life, A spark of defiance flickered within her. Who were these people to judge her? They who had offered her nothing but pity and scorn. "Thank you for your concern, Reverend," she said, her voice shaking but firm. "But I am where I need to be." She turned and walked away, not waiting for his reply, leaving him standing in the middle of the road with a look of stunned disbelief on his face. She did not run. She walked with a steady, deliberate pace, each step an act of rebellion. But the conflict he had ignited within her raged all the way back to the cabin. That night, another storm rolled in, more ferocious than any that had come before. The wind shrieked through the pines, and the rain came down in solid, blinding sheets, hammering on the roof like 1,000 angry fists. The storm isolated the cabin completely, cutting it off from the rest of the world, making it the only solid point in a universe of chaos. The fury of the storm outside was matched by the tempest inside Clara. The preacher's words echoed in her mind, mingling with the memory of Mrs. Gable's condemning stare and the ghost of her husband's gentle face. She sat by the fire, her hands clenched in her lap, wrestling with the guilt and the defiance, the shame and the longing. Elias watched her, his expression grim. He knew where she had been. He could see the battle raging within her. Finally, something inside her broke. A low, ragged sob escaped her lips. Then another. The tears she had held back for so long came in a hot, unstoppable flood. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with the force of her despair. "I cannot do it anymore," she choked out, the words torn from her. "I cannot keep living for ghosts, for his memory, for what the town thinks a grieving widow should be. It is too heavy. It is crushing me." Elias was across the small room in 2 strides. He knelt in front of her, his presence a solid, comforting weight against the storm. He did not speak. He simply reached out and pulled her hands away from her face, then gently drew her into his arms. He held her as she wept, his hand stroking her hair, his body shielding her from the storm both outside and in. She collapsed against his chest, clinging to him, her tears soaking the rough fabric of his shirt. She cried for Thomas. She cried for her lost home, for her lost reputation, for the life she was supposed to have had. And she cried for the terrifying, beautiful, impossible feeling that was growing in her heart for the man who now held her. When her sobs finally began to subside into ragged, hiccuping breaths, she looked up at him, her face wet, her eyes searching his. The cabin was filled with the roar of the wind and the drumming of the rain, but in the circle of his arms, there was a profound and absolute stillness. "You will break me," she whispered, her voice thick with tears. It was the same plea as before, but the meaning had changed. It was no longer a warning. It was a surrender. He looked down at her, at the raw vulnerability in her tear-streaked face. He saw her pain, her guilt, her defiance, her strength. He saw everything, and in that moment, the iron control he had maintained for so long finally gave way. He lowered his head, slowly, as if asking for permission, and then he kissed her. It was not a kiss of passion or of conquest. It was a kiss of infinite tenderness, hesitant and searching. His lips were gentle against hers, a reverent touch, as if he were afraid she might shatter. It was a kiss full of sorrow, an acknowledgement of all the pain that had brought them to this moment, of the ghosts that stood between them. It was a kiss that tasted of rain and wood smoke and unshed tears. It was an aching, beautiful, and heartbreaking thing, filled with the desperate, forbidden longing of 2 people who had found love in the ruins of their lives. And in that small, storm-tossed cabin, surrounded by the weight of their pasts and the judgment of the world, it felt less like a sin and more like a prayer. The kiss in the storm was not an end to their sorrows, but a beginning of a different kind. In the days that followed, a new and fragile intimacy bloomed in the small cabin. The silences were still there, but now they were laced with a quiet tenderness. A glance across the hearth could hold a novel's worth of meaning. A simple touch as they worked side by side could speak of a shared hope so delicate they hardly dared to breathe its name. They were two solitary stars who had, against all odds, found a shared orbit, creating a small, warm world of their own in the cold, vast emptiness. But the outside world, the world of violence and consequence, was not finished with them. The news came, as it always did, on the back of a tired horse. A trapper, heading down from the high country, stopped in Dry Hollow just long enough to spread the word. The raiders had not scattered. Their leader, a notoriously cruel man named Silas Kane, had been humiliated by the town's resistance. 2 of his men had been killed. He had taken it as a personal insult. He was gathering his full strength, and he was coming back not just to pillage, but to burn Dry Hollow to the ground as a lesson to any who would dare to defy him. The news reached the cabin that afternoon, carried by a grim-faced John Abernathy who had ridden out to warn them. "He means to make an example of us all," Abernathy said, his eyes on Elias, especially anyone who had a hand in organizing the defense. After the rancher left, a heavy, suffocating silence descended on the cabin. Clara felt a cold dread seep into her bones, a chilling echo of a past she could never escape. She looked at Elias. He was standing by the small window, staring out at the unforgiving landscape, his profile etched against the gray light. He was perfectly still, but she could sense the change in him. The quiet peace he had found here was gone, replaced by the cold, hard calm of a man preparing for war. He turned from the window, and his eyes met hers. In them, she saw a terrible resolve. He walked over to the corner where his saddlebags lay and pulled out his gun belt. He had not worn it since the night of the raid. He checked the action of the Colt Peacemaker, his movements economical and precise. He began to methodically, deliberately, load each of the 6 chambers. The soft, metallic clicks were the only sound in the room, each one a nail being hammered into the coffin of their fragile piece. "No," Clara whispered, her voice trembling. "Elias, no." He did not look at her. He continued his work, his focus absolute. "They are coming back because of me. Clara, because I showed the town how to fight." "Then we will leave," she said, her voice rising with desperation. She went to him, her hands clutching at his arm. "We can leave right now. We can ride north. They will never find us. We can be free of this place. Of all of it." He finally stopped and looked down at her, his expression filled with a profound sorrow. "There is nowhere to run to. Do you not see that? I have been running my whole life. It does not work. The past always catches up. His kind of evil does not just go away if you ignore it. It spreads. It consumes everything." "I do not care about the town," she cried, tears welling in her eyes. "I care about you. You cannot fight them alone. They will kill you." The image of Thomas, lying broken and bloody in the dirt, rose up in her mind, vivid and terrible. "I cannot lose someone else. I cannot watch another man walk into a fight and not come back. It will destroy me." He reached out and cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs gently wiping away her tears. His touch was firm, grounding. "The first time," he said, his voice a low, pained rasp. "I helped this town from the shadows because I was a coward. I was so afraid of the man I used to be that I refused to pick up a gun while people's homes were burning. I let my own ghosts dictate my actions. I cannot do that again." He looked into her eyes, and she saw not the cold killer of reputation, but a man burdened by a deep and painful sense of honor. "I helped start this fire. Clara, I must be there to help put it out. This is not for them. This is for me. I have to end what I started." She saw the unwavering finality in his gaze and knew that no amount of begging or pleading would change his mind. He was not the kind of man who could be swayed from a course he believed was right, even if it led to his own destruction. She sagged against him, her fight draining away, replaced by a cold, terrifying emptiness. He was going to leave her. That night, the sky was a blanket of starless black, The air was heavy and still, pregnant with the promise of another storm. They ate their meal in silence, the unspoken reality of the coming dawn, a third presence at their small table. After, they sat by the fire, the quiet between them no longer comfortable, but stretched thin and tight with fear and sorrow. Clara could not bear it. She stood up and walked to the door, opening it to the night. The first drops of rain were beginning to fall, cool and soft against her skin. She stepped outside, into the darkness, letting the rain fall on her face, in her hair. It felt like the world was weeping with her. She heard him come up behind her. He did not speak, but she could feel his presence, a solid warmth at her back. "I am so afraid," she whispered to the darkness. He stepped closer, turning her to face him. In the faint, flickering light from the cabin door, she could see the anguish in his eyes. He pulled her against him, his arms wrapping around her in a desperate, clinging embrace. "I know," he murmured into her hair. "I know." The rain began to fall harder, a steady, mournful rhythm. It soaked their clothes, plastering them to their skin. But they did not move. They stood there, holding on to each other as if they were the only two people left in a dissolving world. This was not a night for words. It was a night for a more fundamental, more desperate language. He lowered his head and kissed her, and this kiss was different from the first. It was not hesitant. It was raw, hungry, and filled with a fierce, aching need. It was the kiss of a man who was memorizing the feel of a woman he might never hold again. It was the kiss of a woman clinging to the one anchor she had in a world that was about to be swept away. Their fear, their sorrow, their desperate, fragile love all poured into that embrace. In the cold, cleansing rain, under the vast, indifferent sky, they made a claim on each other. It was a frantic, trembling union, an act of defiance against the morning that was coming to steal him away. It was a desperate attempt to seize a lifetime's worth of moments, of touches, of connection, and distill it into one single, sacred night. They were trying to claim what little life they could before it was taken from them. Two souls clinging to each other on the very edge of the abyss. The dawn came too soon, a knife edge of gray light on the eastern horizon. The rain had softened to a fine, persistent mist. The world was quiet, holding its breath. They parted with few words. There was nothing left to say. He dressed in the gray morning light, strapping the gun belt around his waist. The weight of it seemed to transform him, settling the hard lines of his face, extinguishing the last of the softness from his eyes. He was no longer the man who mended doors and left wildflowers on the table. He was the man he had been running from, the man the world had made him. He touched her cheek, one last, lingering caress. "Clara," he said, and her name was a vow, a prayer, and a farewell all in one. She could not speak. She could only nod, her throat tight with unshed tears. She watched from the door of the cabin as he mounted his horse and rode away, a solitary dark figure disappearing into the mist. He did not look back. He rode into Dry Hollow as the sun was breaking through the clouds. The town was a fortress of fear. The streets were empty, the doors and windows barred. The few men of the defense were in their assigned positions, their faces pale and tense. They watched him ride in, and a flicker of hope passed among them. He did not have to wait long. They came from the south, a dozen riders led by a big bearded man on a black horse, Silas Kane. They rode with an arrogant, swaggering confidence, laughing as they saw the deserted streets. Elias rode his horse to the center of the barricade and waited. Kane and his men pulled up 100 feet away. The big man's eyes narrowed as he saw the lone figure waiting for them. "Well, look what we have here," Kane boomed, his voice dripping with contempt. "One man. They send one man to greet us." He spat on the ground. "I remember you. You are the one who taught these farmers how to shoot back." Elias said nothing. His hands rested on his thighs, inches from the butt of his Colt. I am going to burn this town to the ground, Cain snarled. And you are going to be the kindling. He drew his pistol. The world exploded into chaos. Elias moved with a speed that was not human. His gun was in his hand, roaring, before Cain's had even cleared its holster. The raiders' leader grunted, a look of pure shock on his face, and toppled from his saddle. The rest of the raiders, momentarily stunned, recovered and opened fire. The air was filled with the deafening crack of pistols and rifles. Lead tore through the air, splintering the wagons of the barricade. Elias was no longer a man. He was an instrument of deadly purpose. He fired with a calm, methodical precision, each shot finding its mark. 2 more raiders fell. The townsmen, emboldened by his stand, opened fire from the rooftops. The fight was brutal and short. The raiders, their leader dead and their ranks thinning, lost their nerve. They were predators, not soldiers. They broke and fled, galloping back the way they had come. For a moment, it seemed over. A cheer went up from the rooftops. Elias sat on his horse, the gun still smoking in his hand, the sounds of the battle fading in his ears. He looked at the bodies in the street, at the spreading pools of blood in the mud, and a wave of profound, soul-deep weariness washed over him. And then he felt it, a white-hot, searing pain in his side. He looked down and saw a dark, spreading stain on his shirt. One of the last fleeing riders had gotten off a lucky shot. The strength went out of him. The world tilted, the gray sky and the muddy street spinning into a blur. He fell from his horse, landing hard in the wet, churned up earth. The rain, which had held off, began to fall again. A soft, steady drizzle. It mingled with the blood in the street, turning the mud a sickening shade of red. Clara had not stayed in the hills. She could not. She had followed him, keeping her distance, her heart a cold, tight knot of fear. She had watched the entire confrontation from the end of the street, her hand pressed to her mouth. When he fell, a cry was torn from her throat. She ran through the muddy street, stumbling past the bodies of the dead raiders, her eyes fixed only on him. The townsfolk were beginning to emerge, their faces a mixture of relief and shock, but she did not see them. She fell to her knees in the mud beside him, her hands hovering over the wound, afraid to touch him. "Elias," she sobbed, her voice breaking. "Oh, Elias." He was pale, his breathing shallow, but his eyes were open. They found hers. He was bleeding, lying in a street that had turned red, but for the first time since she had met him, the hunted look was gone from his eyes. She leaned over him, her tears falling on his face, mingling with the rain. "Do not leave me," she whispered, the words a desperate, fervent prayer. "Please, do not leave me." He slowly raised a trembling, blood-smeared hand and touched her face, his thumb tracing the line of her cheek. A faint, sad smile touched his lips. "I am not running anymore," he said, his voice barely a whisper, and then his eyes closed. The world did not come back to Elias all at once. It returned in painful, fragmented pieces. He was first aware of a deep, throbbing agony in his side, a fire that consumed his every breath. Then came sounds, the murmur of low voices, the clink of glass, the constant, gentle whisper of a woman's voice that was the only thing that seemed to soothe the fire. For a long time, he existed in a gray, feverish twilight, adrift on a sea of pain, with that voice as his only lighthouse, his only guide back to the shore of the living. The town doctor, a man named Hawthorne, with hands that smelled of carbolic soap and whiskey, had pronounced the wound grievous. He had dug the bullet out on a kitchen table in the back of his office, with Clara holding a lamp in one trembling hand and Elias's sweat-soaked hand in the other. "The man has a constitution of iron," Hawthorne had declared, more surprised than pleased. "But it will be the fever that decides it now. All you can do is wait." And so Clara waited. They had moved him to a small, clean room in the boarding house, the very one she had once occupied. She did not leave his side. She bathed his face with cool water, forced spoonfuls of broth between his cracked lips, and changed the blood-soaked bandages until her own fingers were stained with his life. She sat through the long nights, watching the flicker of the lamp cast shadows on his pale, scarred face, listening to the ragged rhythm of his breathing. She talked to him, her voice a low, constant murmur, telling him about her day, about the weather, about the plans she was daring to make for a future that included him. She did not know if he could hear her, but she spoke anyway, weaving a rope of words to keep him tethered to the world. Outside that small, sick-smelling room, the town of Dry Hollow was healing its own wounds. They buried the dead raiders in an unmarked plot on a windswept hill, a final, grim punctuation to the violence. The men worked together to rebuild the livery stable, the sound of their hammers a stubborn, hopeful rhythm against the silence. Life, bruised and battered, began to reassert itself. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the town's attitude toward the two people in the boarding house began to shift. The whispers did not turn to praise overnight. Instead, they simply faded. The open hostility in the eyes of the townswomen was replaced by a grudging silence. They had all seen Clara, her face streaked with mud and tears, kneeling beside the fallen man who had saved them. They had seen her fierce, unwavering devotion during the long, uncertain weeks of his recovery. Her love, so naked and so brave, had shamed their petty judgments into submission. The silence, in time, gave way to a quiet, undemonstrative respect. It came not in words, but in small, practical gestures. One morning, Clara found a basket on the doorstep containing fresh eggs and a slab of bacon. Another day, it was a jar of preserved peaches. Mrs. Gable, the preacher's wife, passed her on the street, and instead of turning away, she gave Clara a stiff, almost imperceptible nod. It was not friendship. It was an armistice, an acknowledgement. For Elias, the respect was more direct. When he was finally able to leave his bed, leaning heavily on a cane, his face gaunt and his body weakened, John Abernathy came to visit him. He offered Elias his old job back at the ranch, or any other work he might want. Peterson, the blacksmith, stopped him in the street, clapped him awkwardly on his good shoulder, and said, "You did good, Cain." The name was spoken not as an accusation, but as a title of respect. They did not love him. They did not, perhaps, even like him, but they understood what he had done for them. He had faced the violence they could not, and had paid the price for it. His recovery was a slow, arduous journey. The wound had stolen much of his strength, leaving him with a permanent limp and a new, jagged scar that puckered the skin of his side. He would never again be the man of effortless, deadly grace he once was. The physical power that had defined him was diminished, but in its place was something else, a quietness of spirit, a peace that had settled deep in his bones. The ghosts were still there, but they no longer screamed. They were just faint, sad whispers from a life that belonged to another man. Clara, watching him, knew that she could not let them live on the charity of the town forever. They needed to build something of their own, something that was not born of violence or loss, but of creation and hope. She had a small amount of money saved, coins and bills tucked away from her time at the saloon, and Elias had the wages he had earned. It was not much, but it was a start. "A bakery," she said to him one evening, as they sat in their small room. He looked at her, a question in his eyes. "I want to make things," she explained, her hands moving as if she were already kneading dough. "I want to build something that makes people feel warm and nourished. I want to fill the air with the smell of bread, not smoke." A slow smile touched his lips, the first genuine smile she had seen on his face since before the raid. "A bakery," he repeated, and the words sounded like a benediction. They found a small, derelict shop at the end of the main street that had been empty for years. Its windows were boarded up and its roof sagged, but the stone oven in the back was still sound. They bought it for a pittance, The work of restoring it became their shared purpose, their collaborative prayer. Elias, still not strong enough for the heavy labor of a ranch hand, found he could mend the roof and plane the wood for new shelves. His hands, once instruments of death, were now learning the slow, patient art of creation. Clara scrubbed the floors and the walls until they were spotless, her energy boundless, fueled by a dream she had not known she possessed. The town watched their progress with a quiet, curious approval. Peterson the blacksmith forged new hinges for their door at no charge. The general store owner gave them credit for their first sacks of flour. Slowly, the broken-down building was transformed. They painted the outside a cheerful shade of blue, and Clara hung curtains in the newly washed windows. The day she fired up the oven for the first time was a revelation. A warm, yeasty, impossibly wonderful smell. The smell of baking bread drifted out of the small shop and down the main street of Dry Hollow. It was the scent of life, of sustenance, of new beginnings. People stopped and inhaled, their hard faces softening. It was a smell that promised that even in a land built on hardship, there could still be simple, uncomplicated goodness. Their life fell into a new rhythm, one dictated by the rising of the dough and the cooling of the loaves. They would wake before dawn, working together in the warm, flour-dusted kitchen. In the quiet hours of the morning, they would talk, sharing small stories and quiet dreams. The bakery was a success. Clara's bread and pies were a reminder of a gentler world, and the people of Dry Hollow, starved for such reminders, embraced it. They had a home, they had a purpose, they had each other. A full year passed. The seasons turned, washing the land with sun and snow, and the scars on the town and on Elias's body began to fade into the background of daily life. One late afternoon in the autumn, the sky turned a familiar shade of bruised purple. The wind picked up, carrying the clean, sharp scent of ozone. The rain came, as it always did. It was not a violent storm this time, but a steady, gentle downpour, the kind that replenishes the earth and settles the dust. Elias was standing on the small porch behind the bakery, watching the drops darken the wood of the steps. He was not wearing a coat. He stood with his face tilted up to the sky, letting the cool, clean water wash over him. The rain had been a constant presence in his story with Clara. It had been there the day he arrived, a symbol of the turmoil within him. It had been there the night he had held her as she wept for her lost life, and the desperate, sacred night they had made their claim on each other. It had washed the blood from the streets on the day he had almost died. He stood in the downpour and remembered everything. He remembered the feel of a gun in his hand, the faces of the dead, the long, lonely years of running. He remembered the dust and the fear and the profound emptiness of his own soul. The memories no longer hurt. They were simply facts, the milestones along the cruel, crooked road that had, by some impossible miracle, led him here, to this small town, to this quiet life, to her. He thought of everything he had lost, and of the one thing he had gained that outweighed it all. The back door opened, and Clara stepped out onto the porch. She was wiping her floury hands on her apron, a smudge of white on her cheek. She saw him standing there, drenched and still, and she did not question him. She simply walked over and stood beside him, slipping her hand into his. Her hand was warm and strong. She looked up at his face, at the old scar that mapped his past and the new lines around his eyes that spoke of his peace. She leaned her head against his shoulder, the rain darkening her hair. "You will break me again if you ever leave," she whispered, her voice a soft murmur against the sound of the falling rain. The words held no fear, no desperation. They were a simple, profound statement of fact, a declaration of a love so deep that the thought of its absence was the only thing left in the world that could shatter her. A faint, slow smile touched Elias's lips. He turned and drew her closer, wrapping his arms around her, holding her securely against the steady rhythm of his own heart. He pressed his lips to her wet hair. The shame was gone. The guilt was gone. The long years of running were finally, blessedly, over. There, standing together in the gentle, cleansing rain, there was only peace. They stood there for a long time, two souls who had been forged in the crucible of the West, scarred and broken by its harshness. But in each other's arms, they were no longer broken. They were two halves of a whole, made stronger in the places where the world had tried to tear them apart, in a land built on so much pain, in a world that so often rewarded violence. They had found their redemption not in vengeance or escape, but in the quiet, courageous, and revolutionary act of building a life together. Their love, like a stubborn wildflower growing in the rocky soil, had survived. It had endured. And it had, against all odds, bloomed. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the heart of the Old West. We would love to hear where you are listening from, so please drop a comment below and connect with fellow fans. Do not forget to subscribe to the From Wild West channel for more stories, and please share your thoughts on this one in English.